So we're gonna look at the oil price and then macro indicators. Is this just for the US or do you want to look at macro indicators for the world? Or like major countries across the world?
Just the U.S.
Just the US? Okay. So then what macro indicators do you think?
I don't know. What ones do you think?
Any suggestions?
What was his project on?
It's the effect of macro indicators on the price of oil. You want to see, you think inflation might have an impact? Remember, you should use pi for inflation because I is interest rates. What other macro indicators might possibly have an effect?
GDP.
GDP. You have to be careful with GDP because, well, we're talking about the price of oil, so not really. I would say if you're looking at the oil consumption, that's a component, so there might be some collinearity there. But oil is such a small component of GDP. There's a lot of other things that's going to be affecting it, so you should be okay. But with pricing, definitely be okay.
So like a macro indicator you use for like local events that might generate trigger.
I think there's. Let's just check the internet. There should be an indicator for political stability.
Yeah. So I feel like the big since that would probably
Political stability index. Boom, right there. Okay, well, yes, there is a
Oh, yeah,
political
the World
stability.
Bank. Yeah,
Um, Again, there might be concerns that it doesn't go back far enough. They might only have it for, say, 20 years. I doubt that. I bet it's like 50 or 60 years at least. So, just write political. I'm running out of lowercase Greek letters here.
Maybe like domestic oil production.
That's a good one. What else? Let's see. Price of oil. Obviously, supply and demand is going to have some impact on that too. So, what sort of measures are there to measure the, I don't know, the fiscal standing of consumers? Their willingness or ability to pay.
Like consumer confidence, something like that.
Consumer confidence would be in there. Who knows another lowercase Greek letter? All right, we'll do this side. Say consumer confidence, right? I forgot already. All right. I'm thinking maybe unemployment rate or labor force participation rate.
What was the difference between unemployment and labor force participation rate again?
So the unemployment rate, or I guess labor force participation rate is all the people that are actively seeking jobs or are employed. The unemployment rate is the number of people that are without a job but are actively seeking.
So they're relatively linear.
Not necessarily. So because labor force participation rate is basically like the denominator for the unemployment rate. There's some movement together, but so labor force participation rate has been decreasing for the past, say, 20 years, but unemployment rate during that time has risen, and sometimes it falls. So they don't always move together.
So which indicator would be better for this?
I honestly don't know. I'd probably just try with one and then run the same exact one with labor force participation rate and see which one captures consumer demand better.
So like, there's no like a reason why you would use one over the other, other than it would just produce a better model.
Yeah. If they're, yeah, because there's these variables we use, they're not always perfect to I don't know, control for what's going on. But if you can, whatever you can get that's as close as possible to what you're trying to represent. So we're just trying to say, like, how much money do consumers have to spend on gas? Because gas prices, you know, they're affected by the demand by consumers. And if you're unemployed, and if you're not looking for a job, you're less likely to, you're going to spend less on gas. That's going to decrease the demand some. Well, okay, I'll put delta in there, but that doesn't mean to change the unemployment rate. That means, yeah, I don't know too many lowercase Greek letters.
Throw a gamma in there.
What's lowercase G?
It's like a Y.
It's like that.
That close enough.
If you use 5, it's easy enough.
Yeah, there we go. We'll use that. So since you're doing just the United States for this, you're gonna have to be working with the time series, which complicates this a little bit. So you're also going to need to include a lagged price of oil. T-1 meaning it's the period before. So looking at this, I don't know how often domestic production, those statistics come out. That might be annually. I'm sure the political instability is annually. So you may have to use annual data for this. So you can get like the price of oil like daily or like probably down to the minute.
Yep.
That's not going to be good. You need to have your data in the form where they're all like the same number of time periods. But things like GDP comes out quarterly, inflation like quarterly, unemployment you can get that quarterly. You might be able to do consumer confidence too and domestic production. So if political instability is the only one, and it doesn't change wildly from year to year, you can interpolate the data. You can either have the same value for like all 4 quarters for the year, or you can use some form of like linear interpolation. If it goes from like, say like 74 to like 80 from one year to the next, you can like slowly go up in between, like fill in. You can usually get away with that if there's like 1 or 2 variables out of like several, like this. If you're looking at like 2 or 3 variables, you don't want to like interpolate. Then you're like making up too much. Can you guys think of anything else that might impact the price of oil? Once you start looking, you may find other things that are like syncretic to just the like oil industry. That I don't know, maybe the temperature over like the Middle East and Venezuela, whatever countries like big producers, maybe temperature there will like depend on how long it'll affect how long they can pump oil for, and that might increase supply. I don't know. So something crazy like that we can't even think about that you might want to put in as a variable. Another interesting way to take this is obviously the U.S. is going to have a huge influence on the price of oil because we're such a big market, but maybe look at China as well. Again, they have very unreliable data because they have a totalitarian government who's in charge of putting out the statistics. But still, it's something. Maybe look at Europe as if you can get statistics for Europe as like one market, and see if there's any different impact with them. And maybe even throw like all 3 of those into one model. And then instead of using a time series, you're using a panel data set. Just a thought. Do you guys have any questions about this or any other suggestions before we move on? I don't want to cut someone off if they have like an awesome idea. I think someone got rid of the eraser. Okay. So now for actually running your model, who has experience using like statistical packages? Like Gradle, Stata, MATLAB, SAS, R, any of those?
I know what MATLAB is.
We've done
Use
Gradle
Gradle.
and other things.
Yeah, he usually does Gradle. Gradle's the easiest. So I have here on the canvas, I have the link to download Gradle. It's free and it's easy. You can do it now. You can wait and do it later. I'm doing the video casting thing of this, so I'll walk you through downloading it so you can just do it later. If you don't have your laptop with you or anything. Later on, I'll show you Stata, how to use that. We'll just keep it like very simple stuff for what you might need for your project. I guess I'm kind of glad that no one else is like, oh yeah, I use SAS, because I have no idea how to use that. So you would be on your own. So I'm trying to see if they do anything different for Macs. But if you have Windows, you're just going to use like your computer. I use the 64-bit self-installer. Brings up the page, automatically downloads it there. And then I was like downloading any program. Just click on it and like follow the instructions. Pick the English language. It creates a file folder called Gradle, so you can find your stuff easily.
Should you put in any of the extras or not?
What's that?
Should you put in any of the extras?
What were some of the extras? I don't even know. No. Oh wow, they have scripts for stock and Watson. So when you fire up Gradle, this is what the program looks like. I'm gonna go to Open Data, and I'm gonna use. Oh, so I'll show you this first. So I also included a link to the MBER macro data in there. So I clicked on that earlier, brought it up. The one I clicked on is the Jorda, Shillark, Taylor macro history database. I downloaded the Excel version of it. And here's a copy of it. They have the data here and they have variable descriptions, which is really useful because in some statistical packages, you can't have spaces in your variable names. So they abbreviate it and push everything together. So you have like RGDP AD. But then they have this variable description page so you can go to and see, oh, that means real GDP per capita. Sometimes it's hard to guess from like the weird names. But this data set covers, I think, 17 countries from 1870 all the way to 2016. So it's a ton of data over time. Now, some of these variables like government revenue and government expenditures, there's some housing stuff, bond rates. They don't have data going back to 1870. Back then, they didn't collect a lot of data. So if you tried to make a panel from 1870 all the way up to 2016, you won't have a balanced panel data set because you're missing variables for some of those years. If it's not a variable you're interested in, you're going to use, then it doesn't matter. But if it's something that you'd want to use, you would have to drop the years up until that data is available if you want to have a good model, good data set to work with. So for Gradle, we're just going to open up.
Under workstation.
I think it's the workstation. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so it starts on column one, row 1. Right there. So you don't have to change that. And because there's 3 sheets on there, you have to pick which one of them like has the data. Obviously, this one is going to be data. Has been interpreted as undated cross-sectional. Do you want to give the data time series or panel? We're going to say yes, because this is a panel data set. And then it asks if it's a stacked time series or stacked cross-sections. So because it's doing Australia for all the years, it's going to be a stacked time series. So first is like a time series of Australia, then a time series of Belgium, then a time series of Canada, and so on and so forth. For cross-sectional units is 17, I believe. Yes, 17 countries. So we have 17 cross-sectional units, 17 different countries for 147 years. And now we have our panel data set loaded.
How can you make sure you get data that's formatted that way? Like formatted in a way that Gretel can like interpret it without you having to like change everything?
It does a pretty good job of reading Excel files. So basically, as long as you have a decent Excel file that looks, generally like this, it'll be easy to use. A lot of times, if you're downloading the data yourself, like you're compiling it, so you're getting GDP statistics for these countries, unemployment, inflation, like all those, and you have to like combine them together. It's not the most fun thing to combine them in Excel, but then once you do that, it's like ready to go. Go to under data, you can do. Sorry, it's been a while since I've used this. Oh, there we go. Under view, you can go to summary statistics and select which variables. So say you want to look at the population, this one, regular GDP, and imports. Pops up right there with all the information. With your mean, your median, and then your minimum, maximum values. And then a bunch of more in-depth statistics. A lot of times you don't need skewness or kurtosis, the IQ range. It does have missing observations, which is useful. So, there's 41 years that you don't have imports for. So you don't want to include your years, all the way back to the beginning. And then in order to run regressions, you go under model. First one is your ordinary least squares. Again, that's not going to be good for panel data sets, but if you're using like a typical cross-section of data, it's good to be used for that. So under here, under panel, this is where we go to find what we're going to need for our panel data set. Fixed or random effects is what you want to choose, and then whatever you select your dependent variables, and then all the regressors you're going to use. All right, let's look at housing prices, HP non. And see what impacts housing prices. population does anything, real GDP, exports, government expenditures, and then peg is if they're pegged to another currency. And I don't know, bond rate. You're going to want to include time dummies to account for how characteristics that change over time, and use fixed effects. Here are results. So can someone tell me what the, let's see. How significant is our model? How well do the variables do? Yeah, they're statistically significant, and they're strongly statistically significant, which is a good thing. These down here are all the time dummy variables. You don't worry if they're statistically significant or not. The important thing is just to include them.
What are you looking at to make sure it's statistically significant?
Well, the easiest thing is the stars. 1 star is weakly, 2 is regular, and 3 is strongly statistically significant.
That just comes from the p-value?
Yeah, and it's from p-value right here. So, what is this? Exports, the probability that the coefficient we got is due to a random chance is 0.0004. Super, super low. But for government expenditures, it's 0.74. So 75% chance, basically, that the coefficient we got was complete BS. That's not the professional term. That's not what you put in your paper. Well, maybe the rough draft, but not the final draft.
Government expenditure is complete BS.
Yes. So now another concept is economic significance. And what that means is, okay, sure, like the coefficient for population is statistically significant. It's very statistically significant. But it's negative 0.000055. Does that have any economic significance? So is there actually an effect going on? Now, if your population is really large, if you've got 100 million people, even though that's a small decimal point, it's still going to be a decent sized number. But say our population is only 100 people. So this times, the coefficient times 100 is like 0.005. Considering housing prices are, let's just say the average is 100,000. Is 5 cents out of 100,000 very significant? And all the numbers are off. I want to make a point. So while in this case, we would measure like a strong effect, or statistically significantly like strong effect. In reality, it doesn't really have an impact. It might be precise, but it's basically worthless. So it's something to remember that even if you say, oh yeah, we proved that there's this effect, like showed this great evidence, but oh wait, it doesn't change anything. If you find that that inflation impacts the price of oil by 0.0003 cents. You're like, well, that's nothing. There may be a relationship, it's not going to do anything, so it's not worth worrying about. There we go. The R squared here is 0.89. So is that good or bad? Yeah, that's good. And then another thing to look at is the p-value of the F statistic right here. That's the probability, basically the probability all the variables in your model matter. So that's going to say whether you have a good overall model or not. And just like the p-value for coefficients, you want it to be super low. So in this case, it's 0. So that's a good thing. That's telling us that these variables that I basically randomly selected on the list, that they're good predictors of the housing prices. Now, if you wanted to write out the results of this into like this form, you would just take the coefficients for each one. Well, first with the constant, the negative 38 is going to replace your alpha here. And then for your population, negative 0.00055 is going to replace the beta. And then you include your variable name. And you do that for all the variables in your model. Another good way to display it in your papers is to include a table where you have, well, you can just use this, like just copy those right there, the variables of interest, the ones you want to talk about, and paste that in the appendix so that someone reading your paper can look and see what your coefficient is, how low the p-values are, so if they're significant, see what your standard errors are, that's what they're worried about. And it's important to talk about, at the very least, your R-squared, to say how well your model captures the change in your Y variable. If the p-value of statistic is very low or very high, it's usually worth mentioning. But besides that, your Schwartz criterion, those aren't things that are normally reported or talked about in a paper. Just quickly, I'll go through an example of the time series. Use the Euro area macro data. And this goes from 1970 to 2016. It's quarterly data, and it has a ton of variables here. Yeah, so definitely check out the sample files here on Gredel for your projects. It might have a lot of variables that you could use, and it's that much less time you have to spend gathering the data yourself. For a lot of my projects, for occupational licensing, where we look at the impact on wages, we go to this data source called IPMS. They do the American Community Survey every year, so they go to like 1% of the population, survey them on their job, all their sort of characteristics. Just a wealth of data on people, all about their demographics, family history. So there's a ton of stuff to work with. We just download that file, select which variables we need, and pull it up into Stata. We don't actually poll people or take the sample ourselves. So a lot of economists just work with data sets that have already been created. So that you're not cheating or cutting corners by doing that. It's something useful to save yourself a lot of time. But for this, because this is the Euro area and it's the Euro area as a whole, not like each country within it, it's time series data. So you see, you can't run a panel data set here because it's not a panel. So you have different time series types. There we go. Yeah, so under the model time series, under the AR errors, we'll take you to a random, or a simple autoregression. If you go under the multivariate, that's where you can get your vector autoregressions and your structural vector autoregressions, which are more complicated. You should be fine just sticking with a regular AR model. So if you wanted to estimate let's say imports, MTR. Make that the dependent variable. And see how, let's say, GDP what else? The compensation of employees, looking for wages, price index. And let's throw in short-term interest rates. See those effects on number of imports in the euro area. And down here, this lags. Click on that to set the number of lag variables you want for whatever, for your dependent variable. So yeah, so this has a set right here for one lag term. So it'll be the imports from the previous period that'll be included. Let's say which one was wages? Compensation of employees is when. Let's say you want to do one lag term of that because the employees' compensation in the previous period is going to affect how much they spend in the next period. Because when people think about how much you're going to spend, they take into account what they've made in the past and what they're going to make in the future. They don't just think of how much money they have right now. They try to spread out their spending over the long haul, try to keep it somewhat stable. So you're going to leave 0 as the first one. So you're going to have wages in that period, and then you're going to go to, let's say, 1. You want wages in the previous period. So now you see we've added to our regressors the lag of income and the lag of imports. Oh. Okay, yeah. And that was just, you have to say the one lag. So how did this model do? What's that?
Somewhat good. Not many more.
No, not a lot of statistical significance. The coefficient is, but that's, or the constant is, but that's not.
That's great. That's what we want to see.
Yeah, we want to see the variables be statistically significant. All we have here, excuse me, is GDP. So it's not a very good model. And these p-values, not just are they not significant, but they're very high. Got 3 of them over 50%. R squared is 99%. So what could be going on here? We have a super high R squared, but nothing is statistically significant. All right, so thinking back to all this stuff of multicollinearity. What do you remember from Econ 101 what GDP equals?
No idea. Imports minus exports plus other things times other things plus.
No multiplication, it's just addition and subtraction. So yeah, it's private consumption, government consumption, investment, and then net exports minus imports. And what's our dependent variable? Imports. So because imports is within GDP, it's captured in that GDP statistic, that's going to explain just about everything. And that's why we see it at 99.8%. So sometimes you get a terrible model like this. It's because of something simple. You included GDP, and GDP contains, in this case, it contains imports. In this case, a clue is that the lag term of your imports is not statistically significant. You would think there'd be some significance, that it would follow a trend. That it's not, super random jumping back and forth, that it's generally going on a path. So even if it slips your mind that, imports and GDP, or imports are a component of GDP, you can look at the output of your model and say, wait a second, something's up, and reason through it that way. All right, do you guys have any questions about time series or panel data using Gretel?
So is that a panel series, or is that still a cross section
That is your cross section.
for the oil price one?
Yeah,
Okay.
but you can. Without the lagged oil price, you can use that for your panel data. I don't remember if you can use a lag term for your dependent variable in a panel data set. You can't use the ordinary least squares. You need GMM. Something about the math behind OLS, I don't know it off the top of my head, that you can't use a lagged dependent variable as one of your regressors. Somehow it makes the math not work out. I found that out the hard way. Presenting at a conference. It was like an undergrad conference. I was doing the effect of NFL running back system on teams' winning percentage. So whether they had one lead running back or they had like two running backs splitting carries. Had a lagged of the wins because wins 1 year would impact the next. They tend to be pretty similar. Yeah, and Timmons and I, neither of us caught that. We knew we couldn't do it, and I presented, and no one else knew except for the one professor that was telling me, and I couldn't understand his voice, and he was kind of mumbling. So I kept asking him over and over again what he was talking about, and I was getting super flustered. This was during the Q&A, and finally I said, well, can we just talk afterwards? Does anyone else have any questions? And everyone else was just feeling awkward for me, and I'm like, oh no, I don't even want to be here anymore.
Where was that at?
That was at IPE, the Issues in Political Economy.
Oh, okay.
That was bad. Okay. 840. So next we're going to talk about the structure of the Federal Reserve. We've got 7 minutes left. Let's just end class here instead of starting talking for 2 minutes and me have to repeat it next class anyway.
Sounds fair.
Yeah. Unfortunately, with a class of 13, there's going to be no one here a lot.
Well, there's only 6